Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Welcome to ThinkFest Conversation Session 15. And before we start, I want to thank Yaqub Bangish and the team of ThinkFest Pakistan for providing a platform that doesn't shy away from discussing critical issues from all perspectives. In a world that has unfortunately become highly polarized, such platforms are not only important, but also absolutely essential. Our topic today is gender and the digital divide. But before we move forward with this discussion, we need to understand that the digital divide is real for regions, for countries, and for individuals. When Tim Berners-Lee, who is the founder of the World Wide Web, he just said, very famously stated, that the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disabilities, is an essential aspect. We have seen that digital divide for countries, for individuals is as real as the offline social and economic divides. Offline inequalities, socioeconomic disparities, biases, as well as practices manifest themselves online and sometimes with more force than online spaces. When we discuss the digital divide today, and when we bring in gender, imagine the kind of opportunities that are missed out by women in online spaces, which is half of the world's population. The gender digital divide is not just impacting women, it's impacting countries, it's impacting economies, and it's impacting societies. We have a group of highly knowledgeable and experienced individuals with us today, and I'm really honored to be moderating this panel in the presence of all of them. First, we have Joan Barata, who is a fellow at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University and works all over the world on freedom of expression and media regulation. He has various academic papers and books to his credit and has also worked as a regulator in Spain and was a member of the Mediterranean Network of Regulatory Authorities. Next, we have Uzma Quresh with us. She is a senior social development specialist at the World Bank and has more than 15 years of experience working with national and international organizations on women empowerment. And then we have Jennifer Adams, who is an international expert on gender and media. She consults with various organizations, including the International Center for Journalists in DC. Her specialization is in the areas of program development and policy research for feminist and inclusive governance. Thank you all for joining us today. My first question is to you, Uzma. Unfortunately, we know that Pakistan ranks the worst in South Asia when it comes to gender digital divide. What factors do you think contribute to this alarming, though not surprising, findings from various international and local reports and databases?
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Gulalai and ThinkFest for giving me this opportunity. Like you said, I think we have to look at this issue holistically. And Pakistan has structural inequalities. We have deep-seated stereotypes and biases. We have social norms-related issues, which constrain women's financial, physical, and economic mobility. And like you said, also, that Pakistan has one of the worst outcomes for women on education, health, and economic opportunities. According to Global Gender Gap report, we are at the bottom in South Asia. Almost half of our women, they have never attended school, compared to around 27% of men. And then the share of women enrolled in is systematically, it's lower than men's share across primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Similarly, only 1/4 of Pakistani women, they participate in the labor force compared to 85% of men. You will see only 5% of women in senior and leadership roles. And this also leads to 18% of Pakistan's labor income going to women, which is in fact one of the lowest share in the world. And if you also look at our political representation, despite women's good representation in national and provincial assemblies, there is very less percentage of women ministers in the federal and provincial assemblies. And there is, I mean, if you look at other relevant statistics like, women's access and control over assets and ownership, you will see only 3% of women in Pakistan owning a house compared to 72% of men. And 2% of women, they own land compared to 27% of men. So all this also leads to women's extremely low economic participation rate. If we see again, health and survival rates, millions of women and girls in Pakistan, they don't have equal opportunities, or they don't have equal access to health like men. There is a large unmet need for contraceptives in Pakistan, which leads to women having lower health outcomes. And it also results in women doing more unpaid care work and less opportunities to engage economically. Health indicators, they are also undermined by our gender differences at birth, because I'm sure all of you know that, according to our census, we have 5 million less women than men in Pakistan. And this means that the sex ratio is 1 of 5 men for every 100 women. I mean, this highlights the issue of missing women, which is not a very uncommon phenomena in South Asia, but it also reflects gender-specific gaps on access to healthcare. Social norms, like I said, they constrict women's mobility and their access to public spaces, education, skills, and health services. And in addition to that, going back to digital space and everything, negative perceptions on women's use of ICT, STEM-related studies, and participation in tech jobs. I mean, they have also contributed to a gender imbalance in this whole, ICT digital workforce. Women and girls are also excluded from digital services because of this increased fear of harassment, blackmail, different types of digital violence. So I think all these different hosts of factors, they lead to women having very low access and representation in the digital space in Pakistan.
Thank you, Uzma. Actually, I think the those participants who are joining us from abroad, they'll be really surprised to know that there is a term known as digital parda that is used specifically for women in online spaces in Pakistan. And that was by one of the persons who is doing research in London School of Economics. And he pointed out that just like parda is known, the veil or the kind of covering that you do for yourself to hide yourself from the male gaze, even on online spaces, Pakistanis women are expected to behave a certain way, not have photographs. If the Facebook profile pictures might have flowers or mountains, but never their own faces, or it will have faces of their children. Then even the voice that we talk about and the agency and the power that you need to have on online spaces, that's really missing. So thank you, Uzma. That was quite a comprehensive, account of what we face here in our country. Coming to you, Joanne, you see that lower and middle income countries fare very badly in terms of internet access, digital technologies, mobile ownership, which just doesn't definitely translate into internet connectivity all the time. What is the situation like in US and the Europe? And is the gender digital divide as startling there also as it is in our part of the world?
Thank you very much. Thanks for this invitation. I mean, I want to greet my fellow panelists as well as all the audience, and hope they are doing fine. It's glad to be here virtually. I hope that in the future we can all meet in person. So thank you. Thanks again. Of course, the situation in low, medium income countries when it comes to for example, access to the internet is a very serious problem. It's a very concerning problem. And it's quite understandable that we still, see in these countries and at the level of international organizations, this idea of finally recognizing access to the internet as a universal right that has to be implemented without discrimination, obviously. When it comes to, let's say, Western countries or countries that have a higher level of development, probably the issues that we see are not at the level of connectivity, at the level of access to information or access to hardware, so to speak, but we see serious problems, and we still see a gap when it comes to using access to the internet and connecting and using platforms. And here I can mention 3 examples. First example is something that my colleague Jennifer knows very well. Let's say when women have access to online platforms in order to express themselves, I mean, they face circumstances, problems that are not faced by men in general. So they are facing specific circumstances. For example, when women use the internet to find a job, the kind of problems that they face, the kind of barriers that they need to overcome are completely different from the barriers faced by a man. I mean, I'm here talking about the experience in Europe, many countries in Europe. And if we think about the specific situation now in the COVID or post-COVID in society, I think that in the field of teleworking, I think that, I mean, the society understands better teleworking of men than teleworking of women. And there's this strange assumption that if women work from home, well, they shouldn't be paid the same because they have other additional things to do, and they will not be working in the same way. And we see in many countries that women working from home on the basis of these, I mean, teleworking schemes are paid less. On the basis of the assumption of this is a different kind of engagement, this is a different kind of commitment, whereas when men are teleworking, I mean, they are paid and recognized and protected in the same way as they were working physically. I think that, I mean, there are many other examples that I could raise, but I think that these are 3 relevant areas that show that, again, in Europe, in the United States, the issue perhaps is not at the level of having a cell phone or having an internet connection, but when it comes to, I mean, taking advantage of using these kind of technologies.
I think Joanne has pointed out to this very important part, which is actually the 3rd level digital divide. So usually when you talk about the 1st level of digital divide, it is about having access or not having access. The 2nd level is having the skill set to, try and use that technology. And the 3rd level digital divide is when you are online, like you've mentioned in the US and in Europe and places that you work in, you still are disadvantaged. And that is where I would want to ask Jennifer that we do have all those conversations around access and relevant skills for women to make the best use of ICTs. But when women are able to get over those barriers and when they come online, how does the online spaces treat them? What are the biggest problems that women face when in online spaces? Jennifer?
So first of all, I just want to reiterate what everyone has said, and thank you so much for having me here, and to thank my fellow panelists and everyone who's joined us on their free Sunday. I think it's a good question, and I think Uzma did a really great job of kind of summarizing a lot of the problems that women in Pakistan face, but many of the things she touched on, access to healthcare, bodily integrity, access to the political and public participation, these things are not restricted to Pakistan. Of course, there are cultural and things that are specific to, but this is unfortunately a global truth. And the online world, very unfortunately, has come to mimic our real world. So the things that are happening to prevent women's participation online are very similar as they are offline. Threats of sexual violence, the gender-specific way of targeting women who participate online, and that can range from, as I've just mentioned, sexually explicit threats. It can be doxing, so sending out their personal information to the world for the world to then kind of dogpile onto them and really force them offline. Exposing information about their families, particularly their children. This is a very specific way we see women targeted revenge porn. Shaming women through their sexuality. The same things we see offline are really happening online. And I think what's really important about this, as Joan mentioned, it's always been an issue. We need women's voices, we need diverse voices, and this is not just about women, it's people who identify as women and our friends and family from our LGBTQI and religious minority populations. All of this is kind of wrapped up in the same bundle. And it's really what it is about silencing. It's how do we silence divisive voices. And unfortunately, a woman's voice, a woman's perspective is still kind of seen as not the norm. So a woman's perspective is really marginalized still. And I think that we have this perception that maybe that's not true in some places, Western Europe, the US, North America in general. But we unfortunately see that the exact same things that are happening to silence women offline in a lot of places where women have a lot fewer rights are happening online globally.
That's really true, because the basic aspect of this is silencing those women voices. So having those online spaces, having that presence, and a lot of people, which I've seen internationally and nationally, they don't engage on platforms like Twitter anymore, because they say that the kind of abuse that we face, it becomes too much for us to handle, and it affects families also. So, you know, all that mob lynching that goes on in the offline spaces, they've just transferred into online spaces. And online spaces actually become more toxic, because you can have your faceless enemies, you know, just talking about you and you're not knowing them. So yes, that's true. And this comes to, that's why the other question that I want to ask Uzma is that, Uzma, we like in development, a lot of conversations about digital divide and trying to bridge the digital divide are economic ones. You know, there is an economic equation involved in why this divide needs to be bridged. But do you think that in Pakistan, we are still not over the conversations about social issues? Because the latest GSMA mobile ownership report, that it says it you know, collects data from all over the world. And when it talks about barriers to mobile ownership, there are certain barriers like affordability, literacy, skills, and relevance, which is for everyone in the world. But Pakistan and South Asia has a specific new, you know, barrier, which is the family doesn't approve of internet usage. This is a very big problem here. What do you have to say about it?
Gulalai, I completely agree with you. In Pakistan's case, like I said earlier also in my response, that social norms, they play a key role in shaping the opportunities we get as women, men, and it was highlighted, you know, religious and sexual minorities, also transgender. So in our society, I mean, they limit women, girls, and other vulnerable groups' right to access information and technology greatly, considerably. I believe it's predominantly a social issue in Pakistan, because like you said, in GSMA, it also confirms that, you know, lack of family approval, it leads to, I mean, Joanne talked about, you know, the issues related to mobile ownership and internet usage are probably not that great in other parts of the world, but it's very much a real issue in Pakistan. You talked about GSMA, so there were, I mean, very startling statistics about that, you know, 29% of women, they cited family disapproval as the main reason for not using mobile internet, compared to only 2% men. And then they also said that it was a major obstacle for women to own mobile phones in Pakistan. And this then reflects, and that was again the finding of that report, that Pakistan has the highest mobile ownership gender gap in the world. So this is primarily because of our cultural patriarchal norms that assign more value to men and boys than women, girls, and transgender and other sexual minorities. And most women in our society, they also don't get to make decisions about their, you know, about their lives, about their health, about their education. For example, 37% of married women, they reported that decisions related to their healthcare are made by their husbands. In 40% of the cases, it was a joint decision, which means that only in 23% of the cases do women have the autonomy to decide about their health, which is such a fundamental thing. And you know, we talked about, you know, rampant cyber, you know, online harassment against women and girls. If you look at Pakistan, these negative perceptions, such as, you know, associating women's right to access information and technology with so-called family honor. I mean, this is deeply problematic. I mean, I'm sure you must have seen yesterday's news. It was reported a man in Karachi, he killed his sister And he said that, he said that, I mean, he found it very problematic that his sister, she was talking to some man on phone, and he killed her to protect his family honor. So these horrific acts of violence, they are not a one-off occurrence. They are not exception to the norm in Pakistan. Sadly, they are the norm. I mean, they manifest deep-rooted patriarchal notions that women are inferior to men, and this leads to women being deprived of so many equal opportunities they could get in all spheres of lives. I mean, if again, I mean, social norms, they are directly related to violence against women in Pakistan.
Yeah.
I mean, 39% of women in Pakistan, they experience physical and emotional violence at the hands of their husbands. There and very, very problematic thing is that there is also a widespread acceptance of violence against women and girls in Pakistan. I mean, 42% of women and 40% of men, they think it's totally okay to hit, for a husband to hit his wife if she does one of the following, which is so, little, like, if she burns the food, if she neglects the children, if she argues with the husband, if she argues with in-laws, if she goes out without telling her husband. So yes, norms definitely play a great role in dictating women and men's lives in our society. And it's not always positive. And like you said, I mean, these norms definitely are the main factor. And then if you link them with, of course, lack of affordability, access, skills, literacy, digital literacy, it all limits women's choices to use technology and internet. I mean, overall, our national surveys also indicate that, 21% of males, I think they said they had used the internet compared to only 12% of women in Pakistan. So yes, I believe social norms do play a very big role.
And this idea about honor and killing for the sake of honor. So we do have cases, very unfortunate cases, where a very popular social media star was murdered for honor because of her online presence. And then there was this video that went viral of some girls dancing at a family event in the north of Pakistan, and those girls got killed in honor. So online spaces are really, really scary for women in Pakistan. And it's also sad, because how do we see ourselves in the future if we have half of the population not willing to participate, not willing but not being able to participate on online spaces and get the opportunities that men do. Joanne, that brings me to a question on international standards. You work a lot on these standards. So how do you see the issue of gender and the digital divide in terms of international standards?
Yeah, thank you. Well, as it happens in many other areas, I would say that this is not a problem of lack of international standards. Nowadays, we have plenty of treaties at all levels. We have plenty of declarations, statements, commitments made at the level of the United Nations, but also at the regional level, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the European the Council of Europe, the OSCE. In Asia, probably it's a little bit harder to find, let's say, international or regional standards in this field, but I'm sure that the level of Asia, and we might be able to find something. So there are international standards in place, but something, and of course, I mean, what we see is lack of political willingness, I mean, to incorporate or to live up to these international standards at the national level. But this being said, also that, I mean, I've also found, I mean, looking into these matters, is that I see some degree of separation and mutual ignorance, if you wish, between international standards referring to media and international standards referring to gender balance, gender equality, etc. They have been drafted by different bodies, different people, and they are implemented also by different kinds of bodies with different sensitivities, etc. So I think what we still are missing, particularly in the field of international law, those who work in international law, is a kind of a comprehensive approach to both freedom of expression, gender equality, a proper understanding that they are not incompatible, but that they need to be understood together in a consistent manner, so that we don't, let's say, take an approach to gender equality that imposes excessive restrictions on the right to freedom of expression on the one hand, but we also don't take a vision of freedom of expression that is too formal, that doesn't understand that states have different responsibilities when it comes to men or women when creating the conditions for the exercise of such a fundamental right. So I think that we have plenty of standards, but we still lack at the level of international institutions a comprehensive approach. And I think that those who are experts in one thing are not expert in the other thing.
Yeah.
And we have conferences of freedom of expression, we have conferences of gender equality, but I mean, we still lack this common language when it comes to seeing this as part of the same international body of norms.
So that brings us to this this whole notion of mainstreaming and integrating all these debates together for effective policy making and regulation. Because if you have just people talking about gender at one side and freedom on one side and something else on the other side, it doesn't really help, because then it's not something which is holistic, as Uzma also mentioned in the beginning. So that's true. Jennifer, just like we talked about the gender digital divide problem being a really big social problem in Pakistan, we also understand that the world over, the gender digital divide has real economic implications. So in your work across different continents in the world, and especially with women who are online and are not being able to use those opportunities well, what are the examples and what are the kind of discrimination you think that they face where they're not being able to realize their full economic potential?
I want to go macro and then I'll come micro. And I think looking kind of at the big scale, women are a resource. If we want to take out the whole discussion about, it's not fair, it's not nice, it's not, we need to include women. Women are a resource. And we know time and time again, women are a significant resource. Women make significant contribution to their communities and their broader neighborhoods. Women have massive investment in their communities. Women also are a doorway for other marginalized communities. So my specialization, of course, is in journalism. But when you look at women journalists, they're more likely to interview other women or people from other marginalized groups or people who haven't been heard from largely. So when we put obstacles in the way of women's participation, we are really effectively narrowing the human resource we can use in this world. I mean, that's really kind of the basics of it. So when you're prohibiting women from participating online, which I think no one would debate that more and more of our economy is moving online, we're really kind of limiting the role that women as a resource can have on their local and more global communities. If you want to look specifically, again, I'll use a journalism reference because that's kind of my background. But when you look at women who are crowdfunding, or when you look at women who are looking for sources, and when you're looking at women who are kind of highlighting issues and bringing information to the general population that isn't widely known, if you minimize that outlet, if you minimize that information available for the rest of society, everyone suffers. And not only that, women lose access as well. So it's kind of, I don't like to talk about it as how are women really being curtailed, and how, someone said earlier, women are missing out on opportunities. It's not just that women are missing out on opportunities. We are all missing out by denying women the opportunity to participate online. And it just, the whole conversation kind of balloons from there, the ties between poverty and the fact that poverty is more intensely felt by women and girls. And, online participation could minimize that, but we see in fact that it's exacerbating those poverty and the inequalities in our societies. Things like the realms in which women are allowed to delve. So areas where women haven't been really effectively policymakers or contributing to public conversation, those things have been migrating online and women have had much more of a say. I'll give you an example. There was a small community that I worked with in Serbia, and they had over many years not really had a lot of power when it came to policy making and voting and things like this because of how remote they were and how little access they had to the internet. The women in their community got involved actually through kind of, in no way political, they were doing it to kind of connect with one another about something completely irrelevant. But as that community grew and as those women decided, oh, my needs would be better met with connectivity with other women across the internet in Serbia, they got more and more power, and they were able to bring things to their community that normally they wouldn't have been because they had participation and representation. So really denying the opportunities to women online, it's really a massive loss of a huge resource for the world.
Yeah, that's true. It's not just denying women of their basic rights. It's actually denying the country and the world at large for what we can together achieve. Uzma, Jennifer pointed out to this, this concept about women being very important human resources. So my question to you is that what is your take on investing in girls at a young age for digital literacy and ICT skills? Because we know that that can play a very big role in not just encouraging uptake of technology later on in life, but it also leads to maximizing economic opportunities for these girls. A lot of World Bank's work is around the digital divide and digital dividends, if we bridge that divide. What is your take on it? And if you can give us a few examples of how it's being done in certain countries.
Thanks, Gulalai. You talked about World Bank's different interventions in different countries. I think in Pakistan and in other countries, I'll give some examples. We are using an integrated approach, like we have been discussing, and it's embedded in our support to the government of Pakistan also at all levels through our various interventions, which are not just related to gender and digital divide. They also cover, health-related interventions, education interventions. So that way it is embedding, and it is coming across all sectors. So first of all, our digital infrastructure related programs, they are focusing on increasing connectivity, digital connectivity, and inclusion to ensure that majority of population at least in different parts of Pakistan, for instance, in Balochistan and in other parts of Pakistan, it's a huge issue. So they are able to access high speed and more affordable internet services. And this will also enable, of course, women to access knowledge about markets, jobs, to public and private services, and through different digital sources. And I mean, if you again, go into, rural and urban divide, in our rural areas, you will see very less, digital penetration. In fact, in Punjab, which is supposedly, doing well, only 6% women in rural areas, they have used internet in the past 3 months, and in KP's case, it's 5% in the past 12 months, and in Punjab's case, we are comparing it with 23% of men in rural areas. So the difference is definitely huge and stark. And through this programming, we will also improve women and men's access to different government digital platforms and data centers. And this has been happening in other regions also, not just in Pakistan. Secondly, one of our main focus is to tackle online harassment. Which again, like I said, I mean, it's not just online harassment. I mean, several of our programs, they address gender-based violence related, response and prevention related interventions. But for digital connectivity and related programs, we are talking about online harassment. Especially for women and girls and other sexual minorities. So what we need to do is we must strengthen platforms that provide legal and counseling services to address harassment. I mean, according to a national helpline, which we are also supporting, the total number of cases in the aftermath of COVID-19, they increased exponentially. In fact, they increased 145% from January and February to March alone. And like Jennifer said, I mean, this harassment and this violence, it's about, all sorts of threats to women and girls' lives, and, rape threats and, murder threats, you name it.
Porn also includes,
revenge porn, everything. So I think in addition to strengthening these helplines, we also need to support the government in organizing, awareness raising interventions with development partners to highlight this issue and work towards its prevention, because response is not enough. So we have to tackle those harmful social norms that are perpetuating it. And several interventions in Pakistan, you must have heard, telemedicine, doctors, they were greatly affected because there was rampant harassment, which the women doctors, they faced online. So that's why I think it is very important. Then, improving women's economic opportunities is a very big concern for us. Yeah, very, very big area for women and girls, by provision of digital skills, literacy, employment options. So one of our programs in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, it's working towards that in collaboration with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa IT board. But then we also need to have some sort of robust plan and strategy at the federal and provincial level to tackle issues related to students' access to digital literacy and training of teachers also for online education. So these are some of the areas we are trying to figure out. One of the government projects on higher education in Pakistan that we are financing, it will also support the government to provide devices to girl students to tackle issues of access and affordability in online education. And then our enterprise support, again, which we are developing in the aftermath of COVID, it will strengthen women entrepreneurs' access to online trainings, to registration mechanisms, and provision of, again, mobile phones also with data packages, which is to acknowledge, and bridge the gender gap in mobile ownership and internet access. And this is in line with several of our interventions that we did very successfully in Africa, in different African countries, related to women's economic empowerment, with women's entrepreneurship, and linking it with digital connectivity. So I think availability of high speed network infrastructure, improving women's access to services through government digital platforms, data centers, but also enhancing legal frameworks, for data protection, privacy, and women's safety. Women's access to digital skills, their literacy, their access to digital jobs in various parts of Pakistan, in remote areas of Pakistan, is the way forward. And so that's how we are.
I think, thank you, Uzma. That was quite a comprehensive response to this question, because yes, it covers almost all areas of Pakistan, and how at different levels, it can't just be gender, related interventions. It has to be more comprehensive, like infrastructure based, where you provide, internet connectivity, and then work towards, as Joanne mentioned, integrate gender into all these interventions, so that they're not seen as a gender alone intervention, which sometimes, have that connotation in Pakistan, especially, that, oh, this is just for women, because we need to bring in this concept of women and men both together are going to take this country and the world forward. It can't just be, this kind of a separations that we are trying to see. And integrated policy is also something that, and regulation is also something that you touched upon. The other thing that was really interesting was that you are offering mobiles and phones with data packages, because a lot of local organizations sometimes think that if the mobile ownership translates into automatically being on online spaces, but that's not true. There are levels of different, if it's not a smartphone or if it's not a phone that supports internet connectivity, then you just not, on online spaces, and you can't use that opportunity to maximum benefit. Joanne, now I come to this question about freedom of expression. That's something that you love doing. It's a passion with you. So my question is that it is something that is clear in constitutions all over the world. It's compromised, but we all know that it's compromised in several ways in different parts of the world. And I just want to ask you, do you think that the levels of freedom of expression, because we did talk about harassment and all that, but even if it's an equal, for example, if it is an equal space and it's a platform where anybody and everybody can say anything, do you still feel that the levels of freedom of expressions differ for men and women in online spaces? Joanne, are you with us? I think he got disconnected, or can you hear us? Can Joanne hear us? I think he can't.
Yes. I had
Okay.
a little problem, but I think I can.
Okay. Did you
Can
hear our
me?
question? Yeah.
Did
you hear the question?
Problem of connection, but now you.
Did you hear the question, or should
Can
I
you hear
repeat
me?
it? Yes, we can hear you now. I thought it was a third world problem only. Bad internet
Oh no,
connection.
sorry. yes. No, not at all, not at all. No, you're asking about. I understand that you're asking about legislation and freedom of expression at the different national levels. That's it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand.
And do you think that it's different for men and women in online spaces, freedom of expression, even though the Constitution says it's the same for everybody?
Yes, no, I think that what we see is that indeed in many countries, most of the countries of the world, in the Constitution, we find recognition and protection of the right to freedom of expression. This right is protected, vis-a-vis everyone, of course, men and women. But there's something that I mentioned earlier, which is that the right to freedom of expression is not only a negative right in the sense of let's say the state shouldn't censor you, but it's also a responsibility of the state to provide the conditions that are sufficient, that are adequate in order for different communities, different sectors of the population, men and women, to exercise the right to freedom of expression. And here I think that legislation, secondary legislation, plays a fundamental role. And I think that here this is where we see the most important problems. We see very nice formal protections of freedom of expression, declarations of the protection of the right to freedom of expression on the constitutional level. But when we dig into the specific legislation in many areas, this is where we see that perhaps, let's say, the issue of gender divide is not tackled at all. The differences when it comes to gender, minorities, etc., are not tackled at all. So laws that even may look nice, perfect, may have a problem in terms of implementation and may lead to inequalities when it comes to the implementation in certain environments where inequalities, remain. And for example, this is an experience that I had in the region in Cambodia. A UNESCO project to promote the right to access to information. And there was already some legislation in place, but it was clear that women didn't have the instruments, didn't have the training, didn't have the knowledge to file requests to the government to get access to certain information that was of vital importance in order for them to exercise their rights. And it was very interesting to talk to the women's organizations in Cambodia saying, look, the law, we know that the law looks good in terms of international standards. It protects, let's say, the right to access to information, there's a procedure, etc., etc. But if you don't have a program to educate women on how to exercise their right to access to information. If you don't tell women that, I mean, by exercising the right to access to information, they will know about programs, things that they can do, etc., in different fields of life, etc., this is not working. So I think that, I mean, when it comes to legislation, we have in many countries legislation that may look good, even from the point of view of international organizations. They would say, oh, you have a nice piece of legislation here.
Yeah. But the
But
implementation
when
is
it
the
comes to
problem.
the implementation in a society where you need to particularly educate, for example, a certain sector of the society, saying, look, I mean, if you want to find out about opportunities, I mean, this is the website where you need to go, or you have the right to ask for this information on this website, etc., then the law, I mean, is, I mean, it's good, it's nice, but nobody's using it. And we see that because of the, I mean, of all these development programs, we see that in many countries in the global south, you see laws that are even better than the laws that we have in the Western world, because they have been drafted by consultants, by experts, following international standards, etc., but without paying attention to the actual reality where these laws have to be implemented. So if you then have a real program, government program, to let's say, to sensitize women on how to specifically use the instruments when it comes to the right to access to information, you will see a huge gap. You have a law that guarantees access to information to everyone, but you'll see a huge gap. Only 20% of the women know or exercise the right to access to information on the basis of the law. Well, I think that this is something that we as lawyers and as also those who play the role of international consultants need to accept, that we need to better understand the realities where, I mean, this legislation, sometimes under pressure coming from Western organizations, are to be adopted and implemented.
And that's a very important point, and that's actually quite a debated point in Pakistan these days, you know, or what kind of legislation and what kind of reports do our development consultants bring us, and how are they going to solve the very indigenous problems, and, you know, what do we have indigenous solutions to these problems or not? But that's quite a good one. And especially, yes, you can have a perfect piece of paper, and as you said, that some countries like us, they have better legislation than even the West, but then it is about implementing it properly. Jennifer, this brings me to this question on the kind of policy interventions that are needed. You know, like Joanne talks about legislative efforts and all that. But do you have any examples from where you work, from where you work, where effective policy interventions have led to positive results for bridging the gender digital divide? So any examples that you can give us, something that we can learn from?
I mean, I before I give you an example, I mean, I just really want to say, like, I mean, I hate to say this word, and Joan already apologized for using it, but political will. We don't have the political will in, you know, and I think in the West, I think, you know, we have identified gender as this very important thing that we all should really think is very important. And I have yet to meet many people who can tell me why that is. So though we can theoretically talk about how important women are, there still is absolutely no impetus at kind of the highest levels to really make those changes to ensure women's participation. And I think it's because, as I said before, women's voices, women's opinions, and other groups who align themselves as marginalized groups, they're just still the odd ones out. It's still not the main narrative. So as long as women's needs and as long as the needs of other marginalized groups are still seen as marginalized and are, you know, that they need to create extra initiatives or extra incentives while not addressing the existing vulnerabilities in our societies that exist for all of these groups. I don't think that anything is going to change, and I don't think that's different anywhere in the world. I will say, in addition to the political will at the top levels, which is shockingly lacking, I would say everywhere, we need enforcement mechanisms. So you have these two pillars, really. We have prevention and kind of the elimination of obstacles for women and others' participation online. But then you have the other pillar, which is the promotion of that participation. So those two things have to really go hand in hand. We can't just talk about making sure that it's safe for women online. We have to also talk about the fact that women need to access online and women need to have more ability to participate online. So I think when we talk about prevention, police, There are several initiatives I could talk about in Europe. I will mention specifically Ireland and Denmark. They have been really pretty, I would say fairly innovative. I hate to use this word, especially since it's 2020 and we're talking about gender initiatives. And I don't think that any steps we're making now could be considered innovative. But they're really working with their police forces to make sure that they have specific trained departments who deal they aren't relegating it to sexual violence as a whole, but it's really online violence, online harassment. They're making sure that the people who are supposed to be enforcing these things really have an understanding of what the problem is. Because if you go to the police and you tell them that you're being given rape threats every day, death threats every day, and they say to you, what is Twitter, which happens all the time, we have a disconnect there in what our policy says and what the legal framework says and what we're able to enforce. I think that then when we look at kind of the promotion of it, I think broadly our international organizations are doing a real disservice to the world in the way that they are implementing gender and online initiatives. And gender is still seen as a niche issue across every international organization that I have ever worked with, and the full kind of mainstreaming of gender through all of our policy should have happened years ago. And the fact that that's still niche really kind of tells you why the situation is that it is online. But I think Uzma really touched on what I think is the most important initiative, and that is from elementary education on comprehensive digital literacy. And that is for everyone. And that is in everything, and that should be coming from the governments, and that should be, we should be getting the inclusion of different perspectives when that digital curriculum, because of course, if we're just taking it from existing government standards and priorities, we're not going to get very far. But I think a really comprehensive educational strategy will go a long way. And I know that there's been other initiatives that have been somewhat effective. I know there's been a couple of ambassadors who have been appointed who are specifically digital ambassadors and things like this. I think for the most part, men, unsurprising, but at least it's a step forward. But I would really like to see, in terms of the international community, really more of a focus on the gender mainstreaming of all our policies, instead of just kind of part and parcel of a media strategy here or a safety strategy here. So I think that that's kind of the key, is this holistic approach that everyone's just been talking about that I can only echo.
Yeah. Uzma, Jennifer actually pointed towards something really interesting that we who work in development face a lot, that, gender is not a niche or a standalone thing. It has to be mainstreamed into policies and to development programs to be able to get the results that we're kind of looking at. So do you think that even though it does talk about, I mean, my question is more about gender desegregated data, but that will also give us, I mean, the kind of information that we need to set our targets and create strategies and help us track progress, because that will be something that is like, the data that we use and the evidence that we use. Do you think that in countries like ours, that can help us plan better?
Thanks, Gulalai. So your last part, could you repeat that? So you talked about gender disaggregated data?
Yeah, I said that even though Jennifer said that, some of the problems that come with this gender debate and having this niche gender debate is that people think that it's just a standalone function. But then when you work in development, you do want to have that desegregated data so that you can set specific targets and create strategies and then track progress in them. So what's your take on that?
Okay, thanks. I agree with both Joanne and Jennifer. I mean, they have talked about, comprehensive strategies and, which goes much beyond digital inclusion and digital strategy. So I am all for it. I mean, my previous, dialogue and conversation was also about, social, how do we tackle social norms, which is actually the most important and the most difficult thing, not just in Pakistan, not just in South Asia, in the overall world, wherever women are discriminated against. This is because of, deep-rooted patriarchal beliefs. So for me, sex disaggregated data is essential for every sector. be it education, be it health, be it economic participation, be it digital inclusion, that has to be there. But first and foremost, we have to, I'm sorry, I will keep talking about cultural and social norms, because for me, this is the root of, all the problems we have, not just women, our vulnerable groups, whatever problems they have, they stem from, social, patriarchal, cultural norms. So for bringing any change and bridging the gender gap in technology, we have to talk about them and we have to address them. And recognizing women and other marginalized groups' equal right to economic and social opportunities is what we need to do. So if we have effective laws, now I will go back to laws. If we have effective laws to curb violence against women and girls, which also includes in Pakistan case against child marriage, because that is also a very big issue, which affects girls' access to education, their access to digital literacy, their access to health outcomes, everything. It affects all aspects of their lives. And then we don't have, in fact, laws. We need to have laws that will improve working conditions for women in the private and the public sector. For instance, their right to equal working hours, their right to equal pay for equal work. Maternity benefits are not universal or are not uniform across all provinces. Childcare support is not very much supported. In some provinces, you will find some support, but it's not universal. And effective implementation of existing laws, such as sexual harassment at workplace, which is a very big issue. And it cuts across all sectors, including the digital and technology, workspace. If women are not feeling safe, they will not enter the workforce, including digital spaces. This can encourage more women to join the workforce, including, like we said, digital workspaces. And similarly, it's not just about effective adoption of strong laws, it's also about their implementation. Which Jennifer also highlighted, Joanne also highlighted. So in our case, we need government and development partners to emphasize and to invest a lot in massive awareness raising, and not just in awareness raising, also in generating community dialogues, for behavioral change, and transforming these social norms for social, economic, and political equality that we are talking about for women, men, other marginalized groups. If we want to expect our society to realize why it's important for women and other marginalized groups to be an equal player in the economic sphere, including the digital space. And Jennifer also talked about it. We all know, the economic argument is very strong, and definitely, women. It will not just be women who will benefit from if we include them more. Pakistan could definitely boost its GDP by 30% if by women's economic participation, if they are equally participating. So, but resource allocation is also equally important for implementation of those laws. And we have examples within Pakistan. Punjab has, done some remarkable work in the past many years on implementation of women's empowerment package through various interventions. And that can serve as an example for other provinces also. So it's not like we don't have examples, we do. Then again, we need to ensure women and girls have equal access to education and digital skills opportunities. And within that, we have to address demand-related constraints and supply-related constraints also. Then we also talked about, women's access to, health services, including their reproductive health services. That's essential, so that, women and girls, they actually have a chance to have healthier lives, and they could actually engage meaningfully in skills development and employment opportunities. So I think in a nutshell, no intervention can work in isolation. It is very tempting for people like me who work in the development sector to try and chip away at the individual aspect of any problem. But global evidence indicates that interventions need to be holistic, they need to be integrated. And the issue we have in Pakistan is that of a systemic gender inequality. that underlies the surface level differences in digital access for women and men in Pakistan. But until we deal with the underlying problem, we can't really, change things for the better. I mean, Jennifer talked about, political will. Joanne also talked about it. I also think what we need is broad-based policy, legal, infrastructure related interventions that are backed by strong political will. And,
yes.
and in Pakistan's case, we should also have adequate administrative capacity for it to work and for it to benefit women and other marginalized groups.
Yeah. Thank you, Uzma. That's quite a good summary of what we've been trying to discuss. Joanne, Jennifer, and Uzma, we did talk a lot about political will, about development sector interventions, about policy, about legislation. The one area that we need to also talk about is the kind of partnerships and collaborations that you need to have in these different, from these different aspects, because we know that providing access to internet and all those kinds of programs, they require a lot of very strong private sector ownership also. You cannot do without the private sector ownership due to the internet stakeholderism concept, where the power actually and the kind of devices and the kind of infrastructural needs that is supported by the private sector. Joanne, my question to you is that what role do you see for the private sector and telecommunication companies, especially if we are to bring around a digital revolution whenever it happens?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that, all these tech companies, they need to incorporate the gender perspective in all their activities. And here, we need to understand that according to United Nations standards, businesses also have responsibilities in terms of protecting human rights, protecting the public interest in general, having some sort of, let's say, corporate responsibility, but in particular also in the field of protecting human rights. And here, it's not only about the businesses being sensitive, let's say, in the services that they perform, but also the way they operate and the internal policies when it comes to women. Let's say women ownership, how many women own telecom and tech companies, how many women let's say sit at the board of these companies, how many women, for example, when we talk about digital media, how many women are presented in digital media as experts in international policy, not only let's say fashion, for example, but let's say they are they are presented in roles that usually yes, that normally are given to men. How many women are present in the boards of telecom regulators across the world? To incorporate also from the regulatory perspective this kind of approach. So it's not only about again about companies being gender sensitive when it comes to the provision of services, but also when it comes to the whole sector, to understand that they need to incorporate women, they need to engage with universities. First of all, in order to be able to detect promising women who can work for certain companies, also have an approach, understanding that particularly in the field of tech, women can play a role, which is something that has been somewhat neglected, particularly in many countries. But this also has to be understood not only as a PR operation, because it's also very tempting to present that as a PR operation. For example, let me tell you that.
Thank you for being so honest and blunt about it, actually.
but for example, in Spain, the 5 main tech companies, branches present in Spain are led by a woman. Facebook, Microsoft, Hewlett Packard, IBM, and Google. All them, they have women at top. But if you look at how many women are present in these companies below the CEO, then it's only 18%. I don't question, I mean, the fact that these companies
At least
might be,
she's, yeah, yeah.
but I mean, well, that's not enough. Huh? That's not enough. So sometimes this, I mean, this tendency in this field to see this as a PR. Huh? And when you do things, I mean, in terms of PR, then maybe you pick the CEO, the spokesperson,
A
etc.
brand
But you are
ambassador.
not really
Yeah.
tackling. Yes, yes, but you are
Yeah.
not really, I mean, tackling the problem. Because the problem is far more complex. It implies rethinking the way you talk to universities, the way you hire people, so on and so forth. So I think that in the private sector, there are interesting initiatives. I'm sure that there are many companies that are particularly sensitive, that they understand that it's not only about enlarging the market, but also, I mean, doing something else. But I think that is also, I mean, still plenty to be done when it comes to the adoption, if we can call it this way, of structural measures. Huh?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Actually, that's answers. And thank you for actually very honestly, answering this question, because it has to move beyond that PR and, looking good activity. It has to be structural and institutionalized to be able to do well. And the private sector, of course, has a big responsibility. We are coming towards the end of this conversation, but we have a few questions. I think we just have time for one question. So I guess I'll just put the question that we have from Mr. Tasawwur, who's asking that how do we see user responsibility while using digital platforms? So I think that's also important, because we've talked so much about harassment. Even women politicians are harassed, women journalists are harassed, so it's such a different world for them online. So what is the user responsibilities? We talked about the government responsibility, everybody, but as users, how do we engage citizens to be more responsible when they use social media and online spaces? Anybody can answer this. Okay, yeah.
If I may just to start, I think that, I mean, basically what platforms do is to reproduce the problems that we have as a society.
Yeah.
So if we have a society where, I mean, people don't behave responsibly, they believe that you can harass women, I mean, certain things, I mean, of course, you'll see that also on social media, perhaps, I mean, with a multiplier effect, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the solutions, I mean, that you need for these, particularly when it comes to users, are the solutions that we've been talking about a lot. I mean, here we need to talk about education, about integral policies of integration. I think that we shouldn't, in other words, we shouldn't see, I mean, the social platforms, the internet, etc., as some sort of a parallel universe where things that happen are exceptional and we need to fix them for the internet only, because this takes us to, well, a completely different discussion. Is we need to further regulate the internet. We need to, I mean, which is also something that can become a very complicated conversation. I think that we need to understand that the internet, I mean, is just a reflection of the world we live in.
Yes.
And we will, and also, I mean, I remember the discussions about, I mean, the use of WhatsApp in India and the connection between WhatsApp and violence in India. Of course, I mean, I understand that WhatsApp became a tool that in a way facilitated the spreading of rumors, etc., etc. But we also need to understand that this took place within a society where sometimes violence is accepted by, say, the leading members of the community, etc., etc. So don't try to fix WhatsApp without fixing
the offline spaces,
your country, your society, and the way the leaders talk to the people. So I think that, and this means that the solution is not easy. I mean, you cannot just regulate social media, or you cannot just tell users, well, if you don't behave, you'll be sanctioned, etc., etc. You need to fix the society to fix the internet.
Actually, this is exactly what we all, Uzma, Jennifer, you all talked about. There's this very interesting report that came out in 2016, which said that to have and to fix digital divide, you need to actually strengthen the analog components first. That's where policy and legislation and all these areas come in. So you can't just separate the two. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today, for taking out time. Thank you to the internet, which was able to, bring in such people. Otherwise, I don't know when I would meet Joan next, or Jennifer, or even Uzma for that matter. So thank you. It was quite an insightful discussion. And we do reach a conclusion which says that we need to fix the cultural, social, economic, all aspects together. And the political will, the legislative and its implementation, as well as development and private sector, all of them need to come together and have integrated policies and approaches to bridge this gender digital divide. Women need ICTs and the internet and online spaces for the very same reasons that men need it for economic opportunities, for having a voice, having the visibility. So that's exactly what we are looking for education, for jobs. And let's just work towards an inclusive system where everybody benefits. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Gulalai, for having us. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. See you soon.